G'day coppers, welcome back to the bush. In this episode of Lockouts for Driving, we've got an absolute rip snorting humdinger for you guys today. It's a TJM Twin Air Compressor versus the ARB Twin. What works better with air tanks? What works better without air tanks? Which one draws more current? Those questions and more answered. Stick around to the end of the video because we'll show you how with either of these air compressors you can pump up a 35-inch tyre from 18 to 38 PSI in less than 20 seconds. I kid you not. So stick around for that one. But first, let's have a look at the prices.
And here's a price difference, ARB versus TJM. So on the left-hand side, we've got the dollar amount ranging from $0 right through to 800. And of course, that's Australian dollars because that's where I am. ARB coming at $650 retail, and that comes with everything you need, wiring harness and everything. The TJM, now that comes in at $750, so that's an extra $100 over the ARB, but that's not the end of the story. Actually doesn't come with an input wiring harness for power for some reason. They supply the plug and pins but no wires connected to it, so you'll either have to make that up yourself or get someone to do that. Now I did that myself, and it costs about an extra $50 in wire and bits and pieces and lugs and whatnot. And now if you don't have the facility to do it yourself, you don't have a hydraulic crimper or a soldering iron or whatnot, well, you're going to have to pay someone their labour charge for doing that. And that also increases to the cost. Well, the way I did it, well, it was an extra 23%. But does that bear out performance? Stick around and we'll find out.
So you're going to have to do a little bit more double bubble in order to afford the TJM over the ARB, with the TJM a little bit more expensive. But what about the weights between the two? With ever decreasing load capacities, weight is a consideration and it all adds up. So let's have a look at that now.
On the left hand side here, 0 to 14 kilograms. We'll start off with the ARB. That rolls in at 8.4 kilograms. So it's certainly no lightweight. But what about the TJM? 12.3 kilograms. It's 3.9, nearly 4 kilograms heavier. An additional 46% in weight. So it's heavier and more expensive.
So the TJM weighs almost half as much again as the ARB. But does that bear out in the performance? Well, in order to check that accurately, I dragged out one of my pressure transducers. Let's see how they work now.
Now, in order to make this comparison as fair as possible, I cracked out my 300 PSI pressure transducer. All a pressure transducer does is it takes a regulated 5-volt input, and it depends on how much pressure it sees as to what voltage it puts out. Now, I actually hadn't calibrated this, so I thought I'd take the opportunity. I charged up my calibration vessel, otherwise known as empty 9-kilogram fire extinguisher, up to 150 PSI, and took a voltage output reading from the pressure transducer every 5 PSI down to 0 PSI. And this is the response I got. So it's dead straight linear, so I can rely on accurate pressure measurements right throughout the range. And for those interested, that's the formula that I derived from the graph. Beauty. All right, now we know we can rely on our measurements. Let's actually get on with some of it.
Now, before we get into the actual testing, let's have a look at the test setup. So first up, we've got the ARB Twin here. So there'll be our test subject for our first test. We've got a current clamp over here. It's rated to 650 amps. So at any time, we can see exactly how much current this thing is consuming. Now we've got a 5-volt regulated power supply. 5-volt comes out of the power supply and runs into our pressure transducer. The pressure transducer tells me how much pressure is in this case, the 9-kilogram fire extinguisher. The output goes into our mushy meter. Now, a mushy meter is basically a multimeter that outputs to my mobile phone. But the important thing about it is it's got data logging. So not only at any time can I tell exactly how much pressure is in the fire extinguisher or the tyre, but I can tell how much current it's consuming as well. That's the setup. Let's get into the testing. So now we've seen the test setup, let's check out exactly how noisy these things are. And that's a factor if you've got them mounted in your interior. So what I'll do is I'll fire up the compressor, try the ARB first, and check it against the TJM. All right, here's the ARB. And that one seems to be around about 78 decibel. So now let's check out how noisy the TJM is. And the TJM seems to be coming in a little bit quieter at 76 to 77 decibel. So let's compare the results.
And on to the results. Firstly, the ARB. Well, that registered around about 78 decibel, and the TJM was a fair bit quieter at around about 76 decibel. You might be saying, well, that's only about a 3% difference between the two. Why are you saying the TJM was a fair bit quieter? Well, you need to understand decibel, in this case audio decibel, isn't a linear unit. It's actually a ratio, and a logarithmic one at that. And what I mean by that is, let's say when we go from, say, 70 decibel to 80 decibel, that isn't just a little bit louder. That's a perceived doubling of loudness to your ears. And when you go from 80 to 90 decibel, again, not a little bit louder, it's a perceived doubling of loudness. It's starting to get uncomfortably loud at 90 decibel, whereas 70 decibel is a walk in the park. So the thing to take into consideration is why it's only a small jump in decibel readings, it's a large perceived change in loudness.
So the ARB is a little noisier than the TJM, and like I was saying, that can be a factor if you've got it mounted in your interior. I'd much prefer the TJM over the ARB in that scenario. But what about how hot they get? Well, I dragged out the FLIR camera. Let's check it out now. I'm going to run them for 10 minutes with a partial load. So what I've done is I've adjusted the ball valve on my inflator here so they won't trip out. Now these are overnight cold, so we're starting from scratch, and we'll go for 10 minutes. So I'll fire up the ARB, and off we go. Now with the ARB done, it's the TJM's turn. So we're going to fire up the FLIR, start the stopwatch, and off we go. Okay, now with the second test completed, let's compare the results.
So the ARB turned in 108 degrees maximum on the cylinder heads, whereas the TJM, well, that turned in 109.2, almost the same, only 1% difference, but you've got to notice they're both pretty warm.
Well, that probably won't come as a surprise to many people. They both get pretty hot. In fact, over 100 degrees Celsius, and that's going to be a consideration when you're mounting it. You don't want something that can melt easily touching the heads on either the ARB or the TJM. Righto, now both of these come with pressure switches. Once they get up to pressure, they need to turn off, and they have specifications from the factory. So let's check out how accurate they are. It's rated to turn the compressor off at 150 psi and then turn it back on at 135 psi. So I'll get the data logger going. Enable that one, there we go. So I'll be logging both the pressure in the vessel and also the current using the current clamp. Okay, so once it's up to 150 psi, we'll read the meter, see how accurate that is, then we'll slowly let the pressure out until it turns back on again. Off we go. Okay, we reached a maximum pressure of 146 psi. Now slowly start dumping the pressure until it turns back on again. There we go. It was about 121 psi. Now it's the TJM's turn. Again, we've connected it up to the fire extinguisher. We're going to pump up until we reach maximum pressure. This one's rated to 120 psi versus 150 psi of the ARB, and then deflate until it turns back on. This one's rated to turn back on at 90 psi versus the 135 of the ARB. All right, so I'll get the old logging going. Beautiful. And off we go. Okay, so we've got 110, 111 psi on there. Let's start slowly deflating and see where it turns back on again. There we go, 88 psi. Beauty. All right, now we've done those tests, let's check out the results.
Firstly, the ARB. Now, it was rated to turn off at 150 psi, actually turned off at 146 psi, so we're 2.6% short. Not too bad. Now, it was rated to turn back on at 135 psi, but it turned back on at 122 psi, and that's 9.6% short. That's the more concerning figure of the two, because that means your compressor isn't turning back on if you're running tanks as soon as it should to get that pressure back in those tanks. Onto the TJM. Now, that turned off at 112 psi, and that's 6.7% short. It's already lower by rating than the ARB, but we're an extra 6.7% short off the 120 psi rated. Now, it turned back on at 88 psi versus the 90 rated. So that's only 2.2% short. So now we know how accurate the pressure switches are. Let's get on with actually pumping up some tyres.
So when it comes to inflating your tyres, there's two main setups that people have. It's either a very basic setup where you're just connecting your inflator to your Schrader valve and pumping up your tyres, or a more involved setup which involves tanks and perhaps even removing your Schrader valve. So we're going to check and test both ways using both pumps. Okay, so this is the standard setup. We've just got the ARB here, the old ARB inflator. We're sitting at 18 psi in the tyre. I'll just turn the compressor on. I'll start the logging. And we're going to go to 38 psi. Okay, off we go. Okay, that's the ARB pumped up the tyre to 38 psi or thereabouts. Now it's the TJM's turn. Exactly the same setup as before, same inflator, same hose, same everything. The only difference is the pump. So we'll turn the pump on. We're at 18 psi on the tyre. I'll start the logging. There we go. And let's head up to 38 psi. Okay, so we're back up to 38 psi in the tyre with the TJM. Let's compare the results.
So there was a performance advantage of the TJM over the ARB. To inflate that 35-inch tyre from 18 to 38 psi, it was 7 seconds less, or around about 8% advantage. But let's check out the current draw. Now, the ARB was consistently drawing down about 55 amps, which is not an unsubstantial amount of current. But the TJM, well, at stages, that was around about 80 amps, so it draws down substantially more current. That's not an issue if you have sufficient battery and alternator supported, but it is a consideration when you're considering the ARB versus the TJM. Now, whilst this didn't use tanks, let's have a look at exactly how long it would take to charge up a couple of tanks while you're driving along with the TJM versus the ARB.
Okay, we're getting there. Now you can see the two fire extinguishers there. They're my two pressure vessels. And what we're going to do is, because I don't have a pressure transducer hooked up there, I'll just set up my stopwatch and we'll just see how long it takes to fill up, in this case to about 150 psi. So, ready, set, go. There we go, 4 minutes, 4 seconds. Just under 4 minutes and 5 seconds. So just like we tested with the ARB Twin, this time the TJM Twin, to pump up the two fire extinguishers up to its maximum rated PSI, which in this case was 120 PSI or thereabouts. Okay, so ready, set, and off we go. Well, that's substantially quicker. Not even 3 minutes, 2 minutes and 47 or 48 seconds.
Now let's compare the inflation times. Firstly, the ARB. That inflated those two tanks at 22.4 litres in 4 minutes and 4 seconds to 150 PSI roughly. The TJM, that did it in a substantially quicker time of 2 minutes and 48 seconds, but that's only to 120 PSI. Now that's a 31% improvement. That's all fine and well, but what really matters is how fast it can inflate your tyres. So let's check that out now.
Okay, so we're ready to rock and roll. The logging is enabled. This won't take too long. Okay, so we're about 18 PSI. Let's get it up to 38 PSI. Well, we're a bit over 38 PSI. That was pretty quick. All right, let's have a look at the TJM now. All right, so we're back down to about 18 PSI. Start the data logging, and we'll go back up to 38 PSI. And there we go, we're done. We're back up to 38 PSI. So let's compare the two results.
The ARB pumped up that 35-inch tyre from 18 to 38 PSI in a scorching 17 seconds, beating out the 23 seconds of the more powerful pump, the TJM. In fact, the ARB was 26% faster. So why is that? It's all about the delta P. So the difference between the pressure in the tank and the pressure in the tyre. We had about 150 PSI in the tank of the ARB, and when we use a TJM, it was around about 120 PSI. So that extra 30 PSI is what makes all the difference. The bigger the difference between the pressure in the tank and the pressure in the tyre, the faster the air is going to move across. And that's what we're after, a higher differential pressure. And that leads to faster inflation times. So this time, the ARB is the victor.
17 seconds versus 23 seconds, inflating a 35-inch mud tyre from 18 to 38 PSI. Absolutely fantastic. So what do we think in the end? Well, if you are running air tanks, I think the ARB will be your natural choice with its higher inflation pressure. But if you're not running air tanks and don't mind the extra expenditure and can support that electrical current, the additional current of the TJM versus the ARB, I think the TJM will be your choice there. Okay, now don't forget, this is an unbiased review. I actually own the ARB, and the TJM was lent to me by Ryan, who's a mate of mine. Thanks, Ryan. Okay, guys, now if you like this video, you know what to do. Give it a thumbs up. And if you didn't like it, by all means, give it a thumbs down. Not once, not thrice, but twice. Thanks, guys. We'll see you in the next one. So if you've enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell icon. It's really important to us and you won't miss out on our future content. Now, if you want to support the channel, by all means, consider becoming a patron on Patreon, and you get things like early access to our videos on YouTube. Either way, we hope to see you out on the tracks.